Log entry 07:45 hours, December 22, 1941, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. The jungle was a living thing that morning, thick with mist and the metallic tang of cordite, its breath humid, its heartbeat the distant percussion of artillery. The sun was just beginning to burn through the haze, glinting off shattered helmets and waterlogged rifles scattered across the muddy ground. The air was alive with the static crackle of field radios and the mechanical growl of retreating trucks. Somewhere in that chaos, a lone figure moved with deliberate, silent precision, his uniform caked in mud, his eyes raw from sleepless nights. Private Arthur W. Wermuth, Company F, 31st Infantry Regiment, stood 6 feet 2, built like the oxen he once drove on his father's farm in South Dakota. A farm kid, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a man shaped by work, not war. Yet fate had brought him to this boiling jungle at the edge of the world, where every inch of soil was soaked with blood and the rules of soldiering were rewritten by survival. The narrator's voice cuts through the ambient sounds of the battlefield, calm, reflective, but heavy with the weight of hindsight. He wasn't trained to be a killer. He was trained to endure, to dig, to fix, to keep going when everything else gave out. And that was exactly what Bataan demanded. By late December, the Philippines were collapsing. The Japanese 14th Army under General Hama had driven the Allied forces back from the beaches of Lingayen Gulf, past the ruined airfields of Clark and Nichols, toward the final defensive line, Bataan. The men of the 31st Infantry were exhausted. For 3 days, they'd marched through jungle trails so choked with vines they had to cut every yard with machetes. Food was running out, ammunition scarcer still. The jungle was thick with heat and disease, dysentery, malaria, dengue, invisible enemies as deadly as bullets. And still, the enemy pressed in, their artillery zeroing in on every ridge and river crossing. It was here, in the muddy crucible of retreat, that Arthur's legend began, not in victory but defiance. At 7:45, radio chatter came through. A forward scout patrol, 12 men from Company F, had been ambushed near the Pampanga River crossing. Japanese vanguard troops, light infantry backed by machine guns. HQ's order came swift and cold. Do not engage, fall back to a buque line, consolidate defense. But Arthur didn't hear it as a command. He heard it as betrayal. These were his men, boys he'd trained beside, shared cigarettes with, prayed with. He looked at the retreating column around him, hollow-eyed soldiers stumbling through mud, their boots falling apart, their rifles rusting from the rain, and then he looked back toward the river, where faint pops of gunfire echoed like dying heartbeats. He muttered under his breath, "Not today," and turned around. No one followed. He moved alone, rifle slung tight, pistol at his hip, knife strapped to his calf, carrying barely 60 rounds and a single canteen of water. Every step deeper into the jungle was a step away from protocol, away from reason, but towards something that burned inside him, something fierce and wordless. The narrator's tone hardens. In war, there are men who obey, and then there are men who become the war itself. The jungle swallowed him whole. Branches clawed at his sleeves, leeches bit at his legs, and every sound, every bird, every rustle became an enemy's footstep. He moved like a hunter now, crouched low, eyes scanning. The first sign of the enemy was smoke, a faint column drifting through the trees. He crept closer, his breath controlled, his heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of distant gunfire. Through the foliage, he saw them, a Japanese patrol, maybe 10 men, relaxed, laughing, eating from tin bowls beside a captured U.S. truck. His men's gear lay scattered nearby, helmets, boots, one bloody dog tag half buried in mud. He felt his stomach turn. Slowly, methodically, he positioned himself behind a fallen tree, adjusted the sights on his M1 Garand, and whispered to himself, "One breath, one shot." The rifle cracked. The lead man dropped instantly. Chaos erupted. Arthur moved like instinct, firing, reloading, advancing, his shots quick, deliberate, each one finding a mark. 2 soldiers ran for cover. He cut them down before they reached the brush. The Japanese machine gunner swung his weapon toward the sound, too slow. Arthur's bullet shattered the tripod, sent the weapon tumbling. Within minutes, it was over. The clearing fell silent except for the hiss of the dying fire. 10 men lay still. He exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Then he heard it, faint, desperate cries in English. "Over here! Help!" Arthur rushed toward the sound and found 3 of his missing scouts, wounded, one barely conscious. Without hesitation, he dragged them into the cover of the trees, tore strips from his uniform to bandage their wounds, and carried them one by one back toward friendly lines, 2 miles through jungle and mud. When he stumbled back into camp at dusk, covered in blood, carrying the last man over his shoulder, the company commander just stared. "Where the hell did you come from?" Arthur's reply was flat. "The river." He said nothing about what happened there. The official report would simply note, "Private Wermuth rescued 3 wounded men under fire." The other soldiers would whisper something else. He took out a whole patrol by himself. In the days that followed, the myth grew. Whenever the Japanese advanced, Arthur was there, a tall, mud-covered figure moving through the smoke, always leading from the front, always hitting harder than a single man should. By January, he'd been promoted to sergeant. The Bataan campaign was entering its deadliest phase. The Japanese tightened their noose, cutting off supply lines, strafing roads with Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters. The defenders dug in, turning the ridges into killing fields. The air smelled of rot and oil, the sound of distant engines never stopping. Arthur didn't rest. He formed small raiding parties, 5 or 6 volunteers at a time, striking enemy positions under cover of darkness. January 12, 1942, more on point. Rain hammered the jungle like artillery. Arthur's team crawled through knee-deep mud, their faces painted black, every weapon wrapped in rags to muffle sound. Ahead lay a Japanese supply camp, food, ammunition, fuel. He gave the signal. A flash of lightning illuminated the world, and in that instant Arthur rose, Thompson gun in hand, and charged. The weapon spat fire in short, controlled bursts, cutting through silhouettes. Grenades exploded, tents collapsed, men screamed. It was over in less than 10 minutes. 37 enemy dead. 2 captured trucks filled with supplies. No American casualties. When they returned to base, drenched and silent, men came out of their foxholes to watch them pass, their eyes wide. Their disbelief turning to something like faith. The narrator's voice deepens. In that place where hope was a luxury, Arthur became proof that defiance could still breathe. Every legend has its wound. 2 weeks later, near a Buke hacienda, Arthur's closest friend, Walter Zarnicki, was killed by a sniper's bullet dropped mid-sentence as they shared a ration of rice. Arthur froze. The world seemed to stop. Then, without a word, he picked up Zarnicki's rifle and vanished into the tree line. His commanding officer shouted after him, "Wermuth, stand down." He didn't listen. For 3 hours, the jungle was alive with gunfire, short, savage bursts echoing through the mist. When he returned, his face was streaked with blood and rain, his uniform torn. He dropped the empty rifle at his co's feet and said only, "The sniper's gone." From that moment, something changed. He became quieter, colder. He began taking missions alone, deep raids, days behind enemy lines. He stopped writing letters home. His men said he could smell the enemy before seeing them. He carried a captured Nambu pistol as a trophy, a bayonet strapped to his chest, and a Bible in his breast pocket. The same Bible his mother gave him before he left South Dakota. He said it reminded him why he fought. By February, Bataan was hell. The rations were gone, men ate grass, snakes, and horse meat. The heat was relentless, bodies lined the roads, and still Arthur went out. He led one-man ambushes, attacked enemy convoys with stolen grenades, sabotaged trucks, cut communications. The Japanese began posting warnings, "Beware the one-man army." American intelligence estimated he had killed or captured over 500 enemy troops by mid-March. On March 15, he led his boldest raid yet, an assault on a Japanese artillery position threatening the Abuke line. He crawled for hours through swamp and razor grass, his body covered in leeches. At midnight, he reached the base of the ridge. One by one, he crept to each gun, planting charges made from captured TNT and grenades tied together with cloth. When the first explosion went off, he sprinted through the chaos, firing from the hip, cutting down gunners as they scrambled. The entire ridge went up in flames, lighting the sky for miles. He didn't stop running until dawn. The men started carving his name into helmets, scrawling it on bunkers. Wermuth was here. To them, he was a talisman, a living ghost who refused to die. But his body was breaking. 3 wounds in as many weeks, shrapnel in his leg, a bayonet slash across his ribs, a bullet grazing his arm. He kept fighting. April came, and with it the end. The Japanese offensive crushed the final lines. The defenders had nothing left. The order came, surrender. Arthur refused, not until his men were safe. On the night of April 8th, he carried out one last act of defiance, crawling into an enemy ammunition depot and setting it ablaze. The explosion lit the jungle like sunrise. Only then, limping, burned, dehydrated, did he return. He lined up with his men the next morning as General King surrendered Bataan. He watched as rifles were thrown into piles, as men wept openly. He felt something deep inside him crack. The march began, the Bataan Death March, and Arthur was among them. 80 miles of dust, heat, and brutality. He saw friends beaten, shot, bayoneted. He was hit across the face with a rifle butt, forced to march with a broken rib. But he kept going, his will unbroken. They couldn't kill what he carried inside, the narrator says softly. That stubborn, impossible thing that makes men stand when they should fall. He survived the march. He survived the prison camps. When liberation finally came years later, he was gaunt, scarred, but alive. Reporters called him the one-man army of Bataan. But Arthur would shake his head and say, "I just did what any man would have done if he'd been angry enough." The voiceover fades as the camera pans across archival footage, the jungles of Bataan, the faces of starving soldiers, the rusted helmets half buried in mud. In war, heroes are often accidents, but Arthur Wermuth was no accident. He was proof that courage, when pushed past reason, becomes something more, something eternal. The shot lingers on the battered field journal found years later in the ruins of a Bataan bunker. Inside, in fading pencil, one line reads, "Never surrender. Never forget." The camera lingers on the faded words, "Never surrender, never forget." The pencil strokes tremble with the weight of exhaustion, drawn by hands that must have been shaking from hunger and fever, yet they hold steady enough to leave behind a final mark of defiance. The narrator's voice deepens, solemn but alive. Those words weren't written for history. They were written for the man who needed to believe he still existed. The shot widens, jungle mist rolls over broken helmets, the sky bruised by smoke from distant fires. The Battle of Bataan is over. The jungle has gone quiet, but it's the wrong kind of silence, not peace, but the hollow silence of defeat. The remaining soldiers stand under the morning sun, weapons stacked in neat, useless pyramids, their hands raised, their faces blank. Arthur Wermuth stands among them, his uniform shredded, his ribs bandaged with strips of old cloth, a faint limp in his left leg. He's lost weight, 30 pounds in a month, yet his eyes are still sharp, still burning. The Japanese officers move down the line, shouting orders, inspecting the prisoners. One slaps a man for looking up. Another kicks over a helmet. When one officer stops in front of Arthur, the 2 men lock eyes. The officer's sword gleams. Arthur doesn't blink. For a long, unbearable moment, neither moves. Then the officer smirks and walks on. The voiceover whispers, "Sometimes resistance isn't in the trigger pulled. It's in the look that says, 'I am still here.'" Hours later, the march begins. The road from Miraculously stretches like a scar across the landscape, 80 miles of dirt, dust, and heat. The men start with formation, but it doesn't last. Hunger, thirst, and beatings turn the column into chaos. Soldiers stumble, collapse, disappear under rifle butts. The camera shakes as if filmed from the shoulder of another prisoner, a first-person vision of hell. Arthur trudges forward, his breath ragged, his canteen long empty. The sun blisters the back of his neck, sweat stings his wounds. Around him, the world blurs, shouts in Japanese, the cries of the dying, the crunch of boots on gravel. But deep inside, something keeps him upright, not hope, not faith, but anger. Pure, burning anger. Every step is a refusal, every breath an act of defiance. They couldn't take his weapon, the narrator says, because his weapon was himself. By the fourth day, his vision starts to blur. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. His left leg drags slightly, the shrapnel wound reopening. When another prisoner collapses beside him, a Japanese guard raises his rifle. Arthur moves without thinking, catches the rifle barrel with his hand, stares the guard down. The guard hesitates, then strikes him across the face. Blood sprays from Arthur's lip. He doesn't fall. He just looks back, steady, unbroken. The guard lowers his rifle. The narrator's voice drops to a near whisper. He learned that in war, sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is stand still. Night falls. The prisoners huddle together under a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Someone nearby hums a hymn. Someone else prays in a language Arthur doesn't understand. He sits with his back against a tree, staring into the darkness. His hand rests on his chest, feeling the outline of the Bible under his shirt, the same one his mother gave him when he left for basic training in 1940. Inside, on the first page, she'd written, "You were made for good things, Arthur. Come home when you're done." He'd smiled at that once. Now he reads it over and over in his head, the words turning into something else, not comfort but command. He doesn't sleep that night. He just listens to the jungle breathe. When morning comes, the march resumes. Fewer men now. The road is lined with corpses. Flies swarm over everything. The Japanese guards grow more restless, more violent. Arthur sees one officer take a swing at a Filipino soldier who can barely stand. The man drops lifeless in the dust. Arthur clenches his fists, steps forward, but another prisoner grips his arm. "Don't," he whispers. "They'll kill you too." Arthur hesitates, then looks down at the fallen man and mutters under his breath, "Noted." The camera follows his boots as they keep moving. Step, step, step. Days blur. The march ends at Camp O'Donnell, a place that would become synonymous with misery. The prisoners are herded into barbed wire compounds, starving, feverish, diseased. Water comes once a day. Food, barely enough to keep men alive. Arthur is burning with fever now, his body trembling, but his eyes, those same unyielding eyes, still cut through the haze. Even in captivity, he becomes a kind of leader again. He steals rice for the weak, distracts guards so others can rest, whispers jokes just loud enough to make men smile. The narrator continues, "Leadership doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just whispers, keep going." Weeks turn into months. The rainy season comes, torrential downpours turning the camp into a swamp. Men die by the dozens every day. The stench of rot becomes part of the air. Arthur writes in the margins of his Bible notes, names, memories. "Zarnicki's still with me. Mom's still alive, I hope. God, you there." He carves tally marks into a bamboo post beside his bunk, counting the days, 87, 94, 112. He stops counting after that. Then one night the guards drag him out. They accuse him of sabotage. Someone's been stealing food, someone's been breaking water pipes. They beat him with rifle butts, leave him in the rain. But when dawn comes, he's still breathing, barely. The camera pans close on his face, swollen, cut, but with a faint smile. "They wanted to see fear," the narrator says. "He gave them teeth." Months later, he's transferred north to another camp near Cabanatuan. The men there have heard of him, the one-man army. They whisper his name like a prayer. He tells them to stop. "There's no army left," he says, "just us, and that's enough." In that camp, Arthur begins organizing again, not raids this time, but survival. He teaches men how to steal food without getting caught, how to hide fever symptoms from guards, how to trade scraps for medicine. He fixes broken shoes with wire, builds makeshift stretchers, helps bury the dead with the same care he'd once given to planting crops back home. The camera fades between faces, hollow, sunken, yet alive because of one man's refusal to let them die quietly. By late 1943, whispers spread through the Japanese ranks that Wermuth still lives, that he's indestructible, that bullets don't stop him. The legend that began in the jungle now lives in prison walls, and somehow Arthur feeds it. He starts smuggling information, using coded messages in laundry shipments to nearby guerrillas. He becomes part of an underground resistance inside the camp, mapping guard routes, marking weak points. The narrator's voice turns tense. The background hum of strings rising. Even in chains, he was still fighting, because for Arthur, war was never about orders. It was about the man beside you and the promise you made never to leave him behind. Then comes 1944, rumors of liberation. American aircraft spotted overhead, P-38 Lightning slicing through clouds, Mitchell streaking toward the coast. The prisoners stand under the sun, watching vapor trails cut the sky. For the first time in years, Arthur smiles. A real smile. He turns to the man beside him, a young Filipino barely 20, and says, "Told you, we're coming home." But the Japanese sense it too. The guards grow paranoid, violent. Executions become frequent. On one brutal morning, a group of prisoners are forced to dig trenches. Arthur recognizes the pattern. He's seen it before in Bataan, before an ambush. He knows what's coming. That night, he tells his men to be ready. If they start shooting, run, don't look back. The next morning, chaos. Air raid sirens wail. The ground shakes as Allied bombs hit a nearby depot. In the confusion, Arthur grabs 3 men and makes a break for the jungle. Gunfire rips through the air, dust exploding at their feet. 1 man falls. Arthur doesn't stop. He dives into the brush, dragging the remaining 2 with him. They run until their lungs burn, until the gunfire fades. And for the first time in 3 years, the jungle swallows him again. The same jungle where it all began. The next sequence plays like a fever dream, half documentary, half memory. Arthur, thin and limping, moving through the undergrowth, guiding the 2 others toward friendly lines. He knows the terrain by heart, every ridge, every river crossing. They survive on roots and rainwater. He kills a wild boar with a sharpened bamboo spear. They move only at night. The narrator's tone shifts, awe, disbelief. He escaped hell once before. Now he was doing it again. After 2 weeks, they stumble upon Filipino guerrillas, local fighters allied with the Americans. They recognize him instantly. One whispers, "Isang tao na hukbo," the one-man army. Arthur nods, too weak to speak. The guerrillas carry him to their camp, feed him rice, treat his wounds. When American forces finally land in Luzon in 1945, Arthur is there to greet them, skeletal, scarred, but alive. The war is ending. When reporters later ask how many men he captured, how many Japanese he killed, he just shakes his head. "I never counted," he says. "Counting makes it sound like a game." He looks away, eyes distant as if still seeing the jungle. "It wasn't a game. It was my friends, that's all." The documentary voice softens, the music fading to a slow, somber piano. Arthur W. Wermuth, the farm kid who became an army, returned home in 1945. His body bore 31 scars, his spirit none. Archival photos flash, a tall man in uniform standing before a farmhouse, smiling faintly. They called him a hero. He called himself lucky. Fade to black. The final words appear on screen, simple, unadorned. Private Arthur W. Wermuth, the one-man Army of Bataan, 1914 to 1973. The narrator's last words. In every war, there's one man who refuses to fall when everything else does. Arthur was that man, and somewhere in the mud of Bataan, the earth still remembers his footsteps. The jungle of Bataan in April 1942 is a furnace of smoke and silence, the kind that settles only after a long scream. The once green ridges now look scorched and gray, vines melted to tar by artillery fire that had rained for days. Among the drifting haze, a figure moves with a limp, his khaki shirt ripped, rifle slung awkwardly across his back, one arm pressed to his ribs where shrapnel had torn through muscle. Private Arthur W. Wermuth breathes in the metallic air and hears only the distant groan of wounded men and the low thump of a Japanese mortar finding one more hill to flatten. He had been called the one-man Army of Bataan, a farm kid from South Dakota who once believed the war was an adventure. Now adventure is gone. Survival is the only creed left. The American and Filipino forces, starved and fevered, have fallen back to the tip of the peninsula. They are out of food, out of medicine, out of orders. In every direction, the enemy is closing in, pressing them toward the sea. Wermuth looks down at his mud-crusted boots and thinks of Illinois cornfields, the smell of gasoline from tractors, the laughter of his sisters at sunset. That world feels centuries away. He adjusts the strap of his Springfield rifle, glances at a dying comrade beside him, and mutters, "We ain't done yet." It is less a statement of fact than an act of defiance. At 05:00 hours, the Japanese 65th Brigade begins its final advance. Machine guns chatter from the ridgeline, and mortars burst in rhythmic waves. The American perimeter on Mount Samet folds inward like wet paper. Wermuth and a handful of scouts crawl between bomb craters, laying out grenades in a rough semicircle. Each explosion kicks dirt into the air, mingling with black smoke and the smell of burned palm oil. The roar of Type 95 Hago tanks rises from the road below. Their thin armor glints like insect shells through the smoke. Wermuth's heart beats slower than the sound of gunfire. He has lived in this rhythm for 4 months, so long that fear feels like an old companion. He raises his rifle, fires, reloads, and fires again until the bolt jams hot against his palm. A round clips his helmet, spinning him sideways into a ditch. For a moment he lies still, listening to the rush of blood in his ears. When he crawls up again, he sees the white flag rising from a nearby ridge. Somewhere behind him, an officer shouts that General King has surrendered. Bataan is lost. The words don't make sense at first. Surrender means safety, but in this war there is no such thing. Wermuth watches as men step out of their foxholes, hands trembling in the air, faces blank from exhaustion. Japanese soldiers fan across the clearing, bayonets glinting. The crack of gunshots follows seconds later, men too slow to obey or too weak to stand. Wermuth bites his tongue until he tastes blood. He feels the urge to fight again, to die standing. But a corporal beside him grips his arm and whispers, "Don't, Art, not now." So he lowers his weapon. When the Japanese patrol reaches them, he stares straight ahead, jaw clenched, refusing to bow his head. The butt of a rifle slams into his shoulder. Another strike catches his wounded ribs, driving him to the ground. The war, for now, is over, but his battle has just begun. They march them north in lines that stretch for miles, the infamous road that will later be called the Bataan Death March. The sun turns the dirt path into a kiln. Men stumble, some fall, some are shot where they lie. Wermuth keeps moving, his tall frame swaying like a metronome among broken bodies. He tears a strip of cloth from his sleeve and ties it around a Filipino soldier's bleeding leg. A guard sees him, raises a rifle, but another guard waves him off, perhaps impressed by the size of this stubborn American who still walks upright while others crawl. Every step feels like miles. Thirst gnaws at his throat, and the smell of decay mixes with tropical heat until the air itself tastes rotten. He counts each stride in his head, a farmer's rhythm. 1 furrow, 2 furrows, keep the line straight. It is the only thing that keeps him conscious. At night they sleep on open ground. The cries of the sick fill the dark. Somewhere a man recites a prayer, somewhere else a body is dragged away. Wermuth dreams of home but wakes to rain, and for the first time the downpour feels like mercy. He lifts his face to it, lets the water wash off blood and dust. A fellow prisoner whispers, "You're the one they call the one-man army." Wermuth shakes his head slowly. "Not anymore," he answers. But even as he says it, a small ember of pride remains, because deep down he knows the title wasn't just a story. It was earned, piece by piece, through every ambush and every night raid he led in these same jungles before the fall. That memory keeps him standing when others collapse. Weeks blur into months. The prisoners are packed into rail cars, then herded into Camp O'Donnell. Disease spreads faster than rumors: dysentery, malaria, starvation. Wermuth loses track of days, his weight drops but his eyes stay sharp. When guards aren't looking, he steals scraps of rice for weaker men. Once, caught smuggling water to a dying Filipino lieutenant, he's beaten with bamboo poles until his vision fades. He never cries out. The guards call him the Big American, and one of them, a young conscript from Osaka, begins to watch him with something like respect. One night the guard leaves a handful of rice near his sleeping spot and walks away without a word. Small mercies in a world gone mad. By early 1943, Wermuth and a group of prisoners are transferred to another camp near Cabanatuan. There, under a sickle moon, whispers begin of escape. The risk is certain death, but the alternative is slower death anyway. Wermuth listens, calculates the terrain in his mind, the swamp, the guard rotations, the direction of the sea. He's a farmer. He knows how to read land. On a moonless night, he crawls beneath the wire with two others. The first man is caught within minutes, the second disappears into the dark. Wermuth makes it to the edge of a ravine and hides among vines until dawn. For days he moves through the jungle, barefoot and delirious, feeding on snails and rainwater. Finally, he stumbles upon a band of Filipino guerrillas who recognize him instantly. "You're Wermuth," their leader says. "The one-man army." They smuggle him through enemy lines and into the hands of friendly agents. Months later, he's evacuated by submarine to Australia, alive, skeletal, unbroken. In 1945, he returns to the United States, a ghost in uniform. Reporters swarm him at the dock in San Francisco. Cameras flash. Headlines call him the American who captured 1,000 Germans, a confusion born from earlier war propaganda that mixed his legend with another front. Wermuth doesn't correct them. He's too tired for myths. But when he speaks on the radio, his voice is calm, deep, steady. "I didn't fight for medals," he says. "I fought because somebody had to." Listeners across the country stop what they're doing to hear the farm kid from South Dakota who became the one-man Army of Bataan. Mothers weep, veterans nod in silence. He tries to build a life after that, joins the police force in Chicago, marries, raises children. Yet sometimes late at night, the sound of cicadas outside his window turns into the echo of machine gun fire. He dreams of the jungle and wakes sweating, heart pounding. The war never really ended for him, it just changed shape. Still, when asked if he regrets it, he always smiles faintly and says, "No, if I had to do it again, I would." His body bears the scars of 100 battles, but his eyes still carry the calm of that farm horizon he left behind. Years later, in a small Midwestern town, an old man tends his garden. His hands, once used for rifles and grenades, now lift soil around tomato roots. Neighbors pass by and see only a quiet veteran in overalls, not the soldier who once stood alone against an army. Sometimes schoolchildren visit, asking if the stories are true. He nods, tells them only this: courage isn't killing. It's standing when everything tells you to fall. The wind rustles through cornfields nearby, sounding almost like distant applause. And somewhere deep in the archives of war, his file still sits. Arthur Wermuth, service number 19019004, U.S. Army, Philippine SCOUTS, 1941–1945. The ink has faded, but the legend hasn't. Because long before history forgot the names of battles, it remembered the spirit of a man who refused to yield. The camera drifts over Midwestern farmland at dusk, amber light rolling across endless fields of wheat, the hum of crickets where once there had been gunfire, and the voiceover comes soft, steady, deliberate. He was just a farm kid from Illinois who went to war with a rifle and a promise. The frame dissolves to black and white footage of a young Private Arthur W. Wermuth smiling shyly beneath his helmet, then to the burned hills of Bataan, the place where that smile vanished and something larger took its place. History will say he captured 1,000 men alone. History will embroider the numbers, because legends need round edges and sharp hearts. But the truth is finer, rougher. He fought until the world itself gave out beneath him, and he kept standing because he did not know how to fall. The narration continues over grainy photographs, the prisoners on the march, the hollow eyes, the hands clutching canteens of dust. They called him the one-man army, but in his own words, he was never alone, the voice says. He carried the faces of every man who didn't come home. A slow piano note rises. We see him after the war, older, heavier, sitting behind a police desk in Chicago, uniform crisp, eyes distant. On weekends, he drives out to the country, to soil that smells like the one he left behind. He kneels to touch the dirt, and for a moment the jungle falls away. There is only wind and memory. The narrator breathes. He lived a quiet life, raised a family, and never once called himself a hero. But when the nation looked for the measure of courage, it found it in a man who would not bow. The music swells, a low, brass and string blend that sounds like the slow unfurling of a flag. The film cuts to his military portrait, uniform immaculate, gaze unwavering. The years roll by in still images, newspapers yellowing, medals in a shadowed case, grandchildren gathered around a man whose stories grow shorter, simpler, truer. He dies in 1986, not on a battlefield but in a hospital room lit by morning sun. On his bedside table lies a small photograph of Bataan's hills and a folded letter to his children that reads only, "Stand when it's hardest." Outside, the world moves on, new wars, new names, but somewhere a veteran watches the credits of an old documentary and whispers, "I knew men like him." The voiceover fades to silence, replaced by the soft rustle of the Philippine jungle, the same wind that once carried his defiance across the foxholes. Then a final caption appears against the dark. Private Arthur W. Wermuth, the one-man Army of Bataan 1918-1986. His courage became the measure of a generation. The sound of distant surf and a single heartbeat linger as the screen turns black.